All right, let's dive into a classic American meatloaf. We're going deep on this one, folks, going way beyond just a recipe.
Yeah, you know, meatloaf, it's more than meets the eye, right?
Definitely. We've got all our sources lined up and ready. Whether you're a total beginner or a seasoned pro in the kitchen, I think you'll find something pretty surprising in this deep dive.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're talking a dish with a history that goes way back.
Okay, give us a little preview. What are we talking?
Ancient Roman recipes evolving across Europe.
Ancient Rome. For meatloaf.
You'd be surprised. Eventually, it landed right here on American tables, so it's a story of, adaptation, resourcefulness.
Okay, I'm already hooked.
Whee!
But I gotta ask, why has meatloaf stuck around for so long? I mean, it's been around forever.
Well, think about it. It's really a way to stretch what you have, combining ground meat with fillers like breadcrumbs, vegetables.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's a dish born of practicality, And that explains why it was so popular during tough times like the Great Depression.
Right, so it's reflecting that classic American waste not, want not spirit.
Exactly.
Makes me think, is that why it's such a symbol of, like, home and comfort?
I think so. During the Depression, meatloaf let families make a hearty meal even when things were tight.
Yeah, that historical context is really fascinating. All right, so let's get down to the recipe itself. The one we're looking at calls for 85% lean ground beef. Any particular reason for that ratio?
Oh, yeah, there is. You see, it's all about that sweet spot between flavor and texture, right?
Right.
So 85% lean, it gives you enough fat to render out as it cooks, which basically bastes the meat from the inside.
Okay.
But if you go too high on the fat content, you risk ending up with a greasy, shrunken loaf.
Ugh, yeah. I've definitely had a few meatloaf experiences that were a little too greasy.
Nobody wants that, so you want that nice balance.
For sure. Now, I see this recipe also calls for milk-soaked breadcrumbs.
Ah, yes. That's key for getting a tender texture. You see, the soaked breadcrumbs, they bind better and add moisture.
Okay, so that's the key to avoiding, what's the word?
But that dry, crumbly meatloaf.
Yeah, dry meatloaf. Not good. I've definitely had a few of those too.
It's a common mistake. And speaking of mistakes, let's talk mixing.
Oh yeah, mixing.
Big question. Is there a risk of overmixing the meatloaf?
Good question. I've always heard you shouldn't overmix, but I'm not sure why.
Overmixing, it's like the enemy of tender meatloaf.
Okay.
If you work that mixture too much, the proteins in the meat tighten up, and you end up with a dense, almost rubbery texture.
Oh, so how do we know when to stop mixing? What's the, visual cue?
Imagine you're gently folding the ingredients together, not like kneading bread dough, okay?
Got it.
So you want everything evenly incorporated, but you should still see little bits of onion and breadcrumbs.
Okay, so it shouldn't be completely uniform.
Right, it should feel light and loose, not compact.
Okay, gentle and light. Got it.
Yeah.
Now, the recipe mentions using a loaf pan or a baking sheet.
Yeah, good point.
What are the pros and cons of each?
So a loaf pan gives you that classic meatloaf shape, nice and compact, but it can lead to uneven cooking sometimes.
I see.
Whereas a baking sheet lets you spread it out, and that can help it cook more evenly.
Okay, interesting. I always just use a loaf pan. Maybe I'll try the baking sheet method. Now, onto the glaze. Simple ketchup glaze here.
The classic.
It does mention adding brown sugar, which sounds good, but could it burn easily?
That's a good thought. Brown sugar, it can caramelize fast.
Yeah.
So if you're using it, keep a close eye on the meatloaf towards the end of baking. You might want to turn down the oven a bit or even tint it with foil.
Okay, good tip. Don't want any burnt sugar.
Yeah.
Are there other ways to, enhance the glaze without the burning risk?
Ooh, for sure. Dijon mustard's a fantastic addition, for example.
Dijon. Okay.
Yeah. That sweetness from the brown sugar, the tanginess of the ketchup, and then the sharp bite of the Dijon creates a really nice balance.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, this might seem like a weird question, but why do you think meatloaf was so popular during the Great Depression?
Yeah.
I mean, was it more than just, affordability?
Oh, absolutely. It became more than just food. It was comfort. It was a sense of normalcy in a really tough time.
Right.
I mean, imagine the aroma of it baking probably brought a lot of warmth to families struggling back then.
Wow, that's powerful. Food can be so much more than just fuel, right?
Exactly. It's a symbol of resilience,
Yeah.
of community. And that's what makes meatloaf so fascinating to me. It's a dish that goes beyond generations.
It connects us to our past. Okay, wow, we've uncovered some really interesting stuff here.
We have.
But before we jump to part 2 of our meatloaf deep dive, is there anything else you think our listener needs to understand about this dish?
I think the most important takeaway is that meatloaf is a blank canvas. Don't be afraid to get creative. Try different flavors, new techniques, and make it your own. I mean, that's what cooking's all about.
I love that. So we've covered history, ingredients, cultural significance. But before we move to part 2, where we get into more tips and tricks for amazing meatloaf, I want to hear from you. What are some of your favorite meatloaf memories? Any variations you love?
Yeah, what questions do you have about this classic dish?
We'll be back with more meatloaf wisdom in just a bit.
Welcome back to our meatloaf deep dive. Ready for some more meatloaf wisdom?
Oh, absolutely. I'm ready to take my meatloaf game up a notch. So in part 1, we talked history, basic ingredients, how to avoid those common meatloaf pitfalls like, overmixing, dryness. But I'm curious, what are some other secrets to really unlock meatloaf perfection?
Well, let's talk about building layers of flavor.
Ooh, okay. Layers.
Basic recipe, it's got some great components already. You got your ketchup, Worcestershire sauce, onion, garlic.
Yeah, the classics.
But how can we really amplify those flavors, make the meatloaf stand out?
Yeah. Give me those extra touches that take it from good to amazing.
All right, so one simple but effective technique is caramelizing the onions and garlic before adding them to the mix.
Okay, I like where this is going.
It brings out this natural sweetness, adds a depth of flavor you just don't get from raw ingredients.
Caramelized onions make everything better. It seems like a small step, but I bet it makes a huge difference.
Oh, it does. And don't be afraid to play around with different herbs and spices, too.
Like what?
Parsley, thyme, oregano, basil, they all add those savory notes. If you want a little heat, maybe a pinch of cayenne pepper or some chopped jalapenos.
Ooh, yeah. Spicy meatloaf.
It's all about customizing, to your own taste.
For sure. What about a touch of sweetness? I know some people add brown sugar or even maple syrup.
That's another great way to add complexity. Balance out those savory flavors.
Okay, yeah. I've always been hesitant to add sweetness to savory dishes, but now that you mention it, I can see how it would work.
It's all about finding that harmony, right? Speaking of balance, let's talk texture.
Yes.
One of the biggest complaints about meatloaf is that it can be dry or crumbly.
Yeah.
But with a few simple techniques, you can get a moist, tender result every time.
Okay, I need these techniques. We talked about milk-soaked breadcrumbs, but what else can we do to, avoid a dry meatloaf disaster?
Well, you can add some finely grated vegetables to the mix.
Oh, okay. Like what?
Zucchini, carrots. They not only add moisture, but they sneak in some extra nutrients, too.
More moisture, more veggies. I'm all about sneaking in those nutrients whenever I can.
Exactly. It's a win-win. And if you're feeling really adventurous, you could even try adding some chopped cooked bacon.
Wait, bacon in the meatloaf?
Yeah. It adds this smoky, salty flavor and a bit of extra fat. Keeps things moist and juicy.
Bacon meatloaf. It's a new one for me. But it sounds amazing.
It's all about thinking outside the box, right?
Right.
Now let's move on to another key element, the glaze.
The glaze, yes.
Our recipe uses a simple ketchup glaze, the classic. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on glazes. Any favorites?
Well, I do love anything with a little tang. I've done a ketchup and Dijon mustard mix before, and I really like that.
That's a great choice. That acidity from the Dijon really cuts through the richness of the meatloaf, adds complexity. If you want something more adventurous, you could even try a glaze with apricot preserves, Dijon, and a splash of balsamic vinegar.
Wait, apricot preserves. What does that taste like?
Oh, it's a beautiful balance. Sweet, tangy, savory, the sweetness of the apricot, the tang of the mustard, and the acidity of the balsamic. It's all there.
Okay, that sounds intriguing. I might have to try that one. But before we get lost in glaze land, let's go back to baking. I've heard some people line their loaf pan with bacon before adding the meatloaf. Is there any truth to that?
You heard right. It's another great way to add flavor and moisture.
Really?
Yeah, as the bacon cooks, it renders out its fat, which bastes the meatloaf from below.
Well, that's smart. So it adds flavor and prevents sticking.
Exactly. Win-win. And here's another tip. If you're worried about drying out, place a pan of water on the rack below the meatloaf while it's baking.
Oh, the steam.
Yeah, it'll help keep things nice and moist.
I've done that with bread, but I never thought to do it with meatloaf. Good tip.
Works like a charm. And speaking of baking, don't forget the meat thermometer. We talked about it in part 1, but it's so important. You want the internal temp to reach 160 degrees Fahrenheit.
Yes, a meat thermometer is key for safety and for juiciness. And of course, let it rest before slicing.
Oh, absolutely. Let those juices redistribute. Makes it more tender and flavorful. Speaking of serving, what are some of your favorite sides with meatloaf?
Oh, I'm a mashed potatoes and gravy kind of person. Classic. But I'm always open to new things. What are some of your go-to sides?
Mashed potatoes are a classic for a reason, but if you want something different, you could try roasted sweet potatoes.
Okay.
Their natural sweetness pairs really well with the savory meatloaf.
Sweet potatoes and meatloaf. Never thought of that.
It's really good, and you can get creative with the seasonings. A little smoked paprika or even cinnamon adds a nice warmth.
Interesting.
Roasted veggies in general are always a good choice.
Yeah, I love roasted vegetables. They add such nice color to the plate.
Exactly, and you can use a variety, carrots, parsnips, Brussels sprouts, butternut squash.
Love it. Okay, now what about something a little more unique? Any out-of-the-box side pairings you'd recommend?
If you're feeling adventurous, try polenta.
Polenta with meatloaf.
Trust me on this one. It's a creamy cornmeal porridge, surprisingly versatile.
Okay. I never thought of that combination.
It's delicious and unexpected.
Now, I gotta ask about greens. I feel like every meal needs some greens for freshness.
I completely agree. It adds that vibrancy, that balance. You could do a simple salad with a light vinaigrette. Or, sautéed kale or spinach with garlic and lemon.
Sautéed kale. Oh my gosh, that sounds so good.
Simple, but so flavorful.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned sneaking greens into the meatloaf itself earlier, right?
Oh, yeah. Great way to add nutrients and a little extra flavor and texture.
Love it. Maximizing flavor and nutrition. That's the goal. Okay, wow, we have explored so many side dish options. From the classics to polenta to greens, I'm feeling inspired to make a truly epic meatloaf meal.
That's what we want. Remember, there are no rules when it comes to meatloaf. It's about finding what you and your family enjoy.
That's a great point. Experiment, have fun, make it your own.
Yeah.
Okay, so as we wrap up part 2 of our meatloaf deep dive, what's the one piece of wisdom you want to leave our listener with?
I think the most important thing is to approach cooking with a sense of, curiosity and joy. Don't be afraid to try new things, experiment, and most importantly, have fun. The best meals are made with love and shared with people you care about.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, dear listener, we encourage you to embrace that culinary spirit. Create a meatloaf that reflects you. And when you gather around the table to enjoy it, remember this journey we've taken, from ancient Rome to your kitchen. And let the joy of food connect us all.
And remember, we'll be back soon with part 3, where we'll answer all your meatloaf questions.
Stay tuned. All right, welcome back to the final part of our meatloaf deep dive. We've gone through the history, the ingredients, the tips and tricks.
Now it's time to complete the experience. We got to talk sides.
The sides, yes.
Yeah.
Choosing the right ones can totally transform a simple meatloaf.
Oh, for sure. It's like turning it into a whole symphony of flavors and textures.
Ooh, I love that analogy. So let's orchestrate this perfect meatloaf meal. In part 2, we touched on some classics like mashed potatoes and gravy. What makes them such a perfect match for meatloaf?
Well, mashed potatoes, they have that creamy, comforting texture. It's like a beautiful contrast to the heartiness of the meatloaf.
Right.
And the gravy. Whether it's simple pan gravy or something fancier, it adds richness and moisture to the whole plate. I mean, it's classic for a reason.
I agree. I've always loved how those flavors and textures all work together. But what about some less traditional sides? Anything that might surprise people?
Oh, absolutely. Roasted root vegetables are fantastic. Think sweet potatoes or parsnips.
Oh, okay.
Their natural sweetness, it goes so well with the savory meatloaf.
Sweet potatoes with meatloaf. That's a new one for me.
You gotta try it. It's delicious. And you can play around with the seasonings. A little smoked paprika or even cinnamon adds a nice warmth.
Okay, I'm adding that to my list. Though we talked about polenta briefly in part 2. For those who might not know, can you explain it a little? And why it works with meatloaf?
So polenta is it's a creamy cornmeal porridge cooked with water or broth. It's got this really nice earthy flavor that goes so well with savory things like meatloaf.
So it's pretty versatile.
Oh, yeah. You can serve it plain, add herbs, cheese, even roasted veggies to it.
So many possibilities. Okay, I'm starting to see why you like it.
It's versatile, delicious, and a little unexpected. Perfect for a meatloaf meal.
Okay, I'm sold. Now, I can't forget about greens. Every meal needs some greens for freshness.
Couldn't agree more. It adds that vibrancy, that balance to the meal. You could go with a simple side salad, maybe a light vinaigrette, or try something heartier like sautéed kale or spinach with garlic and lemon.
Ooh, sautéed kale with garlic and lemon? That sounds so good.
So simple, but so flavorful.
Right. And you mentioned earlier you can even sneak those greens into the meatloaf itself.
Oh, absolutely. Great way to add nutrients and some extra flavor and texture.
Love that. Maximizing flavor and nutrition. So we've gone over so many side dish options, from the classic mashed potatoes to polenta, greens, all sorts of things. I'm feeling ready to make a truly epic meatloaf meal.
That's what we like to hear. And remember, there are no rules with meatloaf. It's about finding what you enjoy, what your family enjoys.
So true. Okay, as we wrap up our meatloaf adventure, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
For me, the most important thing is to approach cooking with a sense of, I guess, curiosity and joy. Don't be afraid to experiment, try new things, and most importantly, have fun in the kitchen. Because the best meals are the ones made with love and shared with people we care about.
Beautifully said. So to all our listeners out there, embrace that culinary spirit. Create a meatloaf that reflects you. And when you sit down to enjoy it, remember the journey we've taken together, from ancient kitchens to your table. Let the joy of food connect us all.
Happy cooking, everyone!